Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. It is getting close to tax reporting time for your reportable non-US vendors. Now, in this episode, let's talk about how to find those non-US vendors you didn't know you had, and then cover the basics of the difference between the 1042S, the 1042T, and the 1042. So, if you are new to IRS tax reporting for non-US vendors, keep listening. Welcome to episode 326, Getting Ready for IRS Tax Reporting for Non-US Vendors. The difference between 1042S, 1042T, and 1042. Now, I am not a disclaimer first. I am not a tax professional. And whenever I talk about 1042 reporting or even 1099 reporting, related to, right, the IRS requirements, regulations, I always recommend that you review your vendors, processes, and your forms with a tax professional. So no surprise here. I'm going to say that today for this episode. But I will tell you that in my past as an AP practitioner, I was an AP senior manager, and I managed a team of 17, and we processed not only 2,000 vendor ads and changes per month, so 2,000 vendor requests per month, but for IRS tax reporting, we also issued anywhere between 24,000 and 30,000 1099s. And we also had quite a bit, although not as many as you would think. We probably had up to 400 or 500 1042s that we had to issue to our vendors, our reportable non-US vendors, and also the related tax filing with the IRS. So probably not as much as many. The volume's probably not as high as you would have thought it would have been with a lot of vendors. We had 140,000 vendors across 7 different ERPs, and so probably not as many as you would have thought, but it was enough, right? So that we had to make sure that we were compliant. Now, if you have non-US vendors, meaning, like when I say that, I mean vendors that are citizens of another country or an entity that is organized under the laws of a country outside of the US, then you may have to send the vendors a 1042S form and perform the related filing with the IRS. Now, that does depend on whether your payments to them are considered U.S. sourced income. And while that subject is way expansive and beyond the scope of this podcast, we are going to use the example that you have non-US vendors that you paid US sourced income during the 2024 calendar year. Now, another thing about non-US vendors is that can complicate them is that the payments can be Chapter 3 payments, which is the oldest regulation and type of payments that we've seen, especially in accounts payable. Or it could be Chapter 4 payments, which Chapter 4 is the newest regulation. You might have heard of it, right? Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA. And that's related to payments for financing activities. But again, we are going to focus on non US vendors that have US source payments or US sourced income that are classified as Chapter 3 payments. So glad we got that out of the way. And this, by the way, is the easiest part. You get into Chapter 4 type payments, and it can get very complicated, where I suggest you definitely bring in a tax professional. Now, before we start to look at the difference between the 1042S, the 1042T, and the 1042, I am going to assume, since you are listening to this podcast, that you know that you have non US vendors. But I am going to challenge you to see if you have more non US vendors, like in different countries, than you actually thought or think that you have. And if you are at the time of this publication, you've got about a month, a little over a month before you have to send those statements to the recipients and file with the IRS. And so you have time now to check your vendor master file to verify whether or not you have additional non US vendors that you didn't know about. And maybe they are reportable, and maybe you need to send them, right, tax forms. So here's a great way to do that. Now, you don't need to divulge or export any sensitive information, meaning you don't really even need you don't need their vendor registration number, whether that is an IRS tax ID or a tax ID or business ID or number or some sales tax number, maybe even for a different country. You don't even really need to export that unless you think you might have duplicates. But the purpose of this is to identify what vendors you have in what countries. And so the best way that I know to do that is to export a report and only include a minimal number of fields. So I would include the vendor ID, and you can use that to distinguish between one vendor and another, right? Record and another. So the vendor ID, I would also ask you to pull the street address, the city, the state, and the country. And so, what I would have you do, or like for you to do, is everything that says US, you might want to just verify, right, that the US country is the right country. But what you're really looking for are in the state to verify that you don't have what should have been classified, right, as a non-US country. That vendor should have been, but they weren't, because maybe the person that entered it in did not know how to enter in a non-US address. And so you'll find things in the state abbreviation, either whether it's 2-digit or 3-digit, that really look like non-US countries. They are not state abbreviations. And so you might find things like IR for Ireland, right? Or GB, something like that for another country, and maybe even something like CA, right? Because that could be either Canada or California. And that's why you need to pull out the street address and the city so you can tell if it's California or Canada. And so you want to make sure that you at least do that review to verify that the addresses were put in the right way. And if they weren't, just go ahead and correct them. And that way you will know whether or not you have additional non-US vendors that you need to include in your tax filings. So with that, then, let's go ahead and talk about the difference between the 1042S, the 1042T, and the 1042. So I'm going to start with the 1042S because no matter what, you're going to have to utilize this form. And why is that? Because this is the form that you need to send to your non US vendors that have US source income subject to withholding. And the name of the form is Foreign Persons US sourced income subject to withholding. And so, foreign persons, the IRS uses that term as a generic term for both an individual that is outside of the US, as well as an entity that is again set up under the rules of a country outside of the US. And so that is the form that is going to go to your non US vendors who you have made reportable payments and maybe even withholding, to let the vendor know the reportable amount that you pay them during the tax year, as well as any withholding made. Now, this is equivalent to a US vendor receiving a 1099. Now, the second form is the 1042T. Now, the 1042T is the annual summary and transmittal of Forms 1042S. So, the same way that with the 1099, whichever version, 1099 MIS, 1099 NEC, or another version of the 1099 that you must give to your vendor, and then report the same thing to the IRS on their copy, you must do the same thing with the 1042S as well. Now, the 1042T, the annual summary and transmittal of Forms 1042S, is a way to do that if you are filing paper forms. Now, we all know that the IRS reduced the threshold of when electronic filing versus paper, when electronic filing was required. And so prior to, was it last year, the year before last, especially with the 1042s, because at the last minute they came back and said you can file via paper, but not starting tax year 2024. If you have 10 or more aggregate information forms, reporting forms that you need to file with the IRS, it's not just, it doesn't just include the 1042s. If you have 1099s, if you have W2s, if whatever forms you have to file for information reporting to the IRS, if it totals more than 10, then you need to file electronically. But if it doesn't add up to more than 10, number one, you're lucky, and you probably have a bunch of people that want your job. But you know what? It could be, well, no, it's still a low number. I was going to say it could be true because if you don't have a lot of vendors, but 10 is a very low threshold. Anyway, if you are lucky enough to be able to file the 1042T to report the 1042S forms that you have distributed to your vendors to report that income to the IRS, then you would file the 1042T. However, if you have information reporting forms that are above that 10 form threshold, then you may not file Form 1042T, and you need to file the 1042Ss electronically. And at this point, it can only be done in the FIRE system. So you definitely will have to use a 1042S for your vendors. And if you have less than 10 or less, then you can use a 1042T. But if not, you will not use the 1042T to report the 1042Ss that you sent to your vendors to the IRS. You'll use the electronic method of filing the 1042Ss in the FIRE system. All right. So that was the 1042S and the 1042T. Now let's talk about the 1042 form. The 1042 form is the annual withholding tax return for U.S. source income of foreign persons. And so you use this form to report to the IRS the total number of 1042S forms filed, either on paper or electronically, and it also actually gets very detailed in section 1 about the any withholding that you may have done. And so you will need to, if you withheld any funds or any money from payments to your non-US vendors, you need to identify not only the fact that you withheld it, but also when, because it asks you to input the amount based on the tax period. And so for every month, there is a week within the month. And so you need to make sure you fill that out. So, not to get into that much of a detail of this form, just know that you definitely need to file a 1042, whether or not you have electronic filing or filing on paper, it is required. So no matter what, you have to file or complete forms 1042S to the payees, and you also have to report them to the IRS either via the 1042T form that you can use if you have less than 10 forms, aggregate number of information return forms, or you file electronically your 1090 or not 1099s, your 1042s electronically, and then separately you need to file Form 1042 with the IRS, indicating the number of forms that were filed either electronically or on paper, and also indicating any annual withholding. All right, so that is the difference between the three forms. And if you are new to uh, filing, reporting for non US vendors, or for US vendors for that matter, I do have 3 training sessions that I have available for 1099s and 1042s as well. And I will go ahead and put those in the show notes. They are in the Vendor Process Training Center. One of them, as a matter of fact, is on the IRS system. Now, you cannot use IRS with 1042s. It just doesn't accept it yet. But you can use it with 1099, the 1099 series. And I talk about, or I have a demo on it with the 1099 MISC and the 1099 NEC. I also have a training session from step by step, or from an accounts payable perspective, a step by step approach to distribute 1099s and 1042s and file on time for tax year 2024. And then for the year end, and really you can do this at any time. Again, from an accounts payable perspective, year end checklist for the 1099 MISC, the 1099 NEC, and 1042S reporting. And so if you don't think you need to take any of those now because, right, your majority of your tax filing was the 1099s, definitely check those out towards the end of the year. I do them live first. And so I have the next live one is October 23rd with the year-end checklist. But you know what? If you purchase them or you have a vendor process training pass, you get access to them for the whole year. So you can actually get caught up and do the things that I talk about doing all year by watching the on-demand recording. And then when it comes time for the live version, which at that point will be tax year 2025, guess what? You'll still have access to it. So make sure that you take a look at those, and I'll put links to each of the training sessions in the show notes. All right, so that is what I wanted to cover today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 326th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy,